הרדיו הבינתחומי. בינתחומי. 106.2 FM. הרדיו הבינתחומי. הרדיו החינוכי של המרכז הבינתחומי. לכל ישראל. 106.2 FM.
Terrorism's global impact. Highlights from the ICT's 11th International Conference. With Idan Landau.
Good afternoon and welcome to the IDC Radio on 106.2 FM and 106.2fm.co.il on the internet. We are here for a special broadcast from the 11th World Summit on Counter Terrorism held by the International Institute for Counter Terrorism. I'm Idan Landau and I'm here with Professor Alex Schmid, who is also the Director of the Terrorism Research Initiative and former officer in charge of the Terrorism Prevention Branch of the United Nations in the Netherlands. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Landau.
I understand that you took part in the workshop on successes and flaws of international counterterrorism cooperation after 9/11?
I was in fact chairing it, yes. We had almost 3 hours of presentations and discussions and looked at the problem very concretely, for instance, in the area of container traffic, and very abstractly on the level of the UN and national and European regional organizations.
Okay. The 9/11 Commission has pointed out the lack of cooperation within the intelligence and law enforcement community, specifically in the United States, but I can only imagine that it's the same worldwide, or at least it was worldwide at the time. What would the Commission say today, 10 years after that terrible morning?
Well, the 9/11 Commission made a long list of recommendations, and 5 years after the recommendations were made, they were still not implemented. I haven't checked on the status now, but it was a long list. And at that time, there were 14 different intelligence agencies in the United States. I think there are now 16, and the cooperation between them has always been a problem, especially between the FBI and the CIA. There was a firewall because the CIA was only allowed to spy on foreigners abroad, and the FBI was basically limited to continental U.S.
Do you think that it's changed in other countries as well? Did they learn from the mistakes of the Americans?
Well, they make their mistakes of their own. Learning from other countries is often difficult because the institutional setup is different. We think all states are the same. We have now 193, but the smallest one, Micronesia, has 10,000 inhabitants, and China has 1.3 billion. So you can't compare these things. But intelligence cooperation has improved greatly. I think it's a thing of the past that you distinguish clearly between domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence. There's a lot of liaison going on, both intranationally and internationally.
After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Europe and the United States did not see eye to eye on many issues, specifically on Iraq, but in general. How did this tension affect the intelligence cooperation and counter-terrorism efforts?
I think it affected other areas of cooperation more than intelligence cooperation, because in the 2 years after 9/11, new channels were opened or widened, and these continued to function. Many states in Europe especially, had problems with the legality of their intervention in Iraq. But later some of them came in, the UN also came in, but unfortunately both the Red Cross and the UN and national embassies were bombed, which forced, in fact, greater information and intelligence exchange. So I don't think the damage of that intervention was in the intelligence field. It was in a wider field.
I see. Has there been any change in the recent years? Has there been more a move towards one another?
Well, I think that change came after the new administration in 2008 was elected, where there was a different tone in the cooperation, and other countries softened up, or the United States softened up, and cooperation improved after that.
How do you feel cooperation is in between the world community in general, including the UN? The UN itself has some counterterrorism capabilities and more research and
Well, not in the intelligence field. The UN is not allowed to spy on its member states, as you will understand. But when I joined the UN, there were only two units, the Office of Legal Affairs and the Terrorism Prevention Branch, which I was office in charge of, that were dealing with terrorism. Now there are almost 31 entities in the Counter Terrorism Implementation Task Force that's run from New York. But the UN can only do what its member states mandate it to do, and they can only do if they get money from the member states. So, when you hear people say the UN should do this, the UN should do that, and why did the UN not do this or that, the UN is basically a platform, a forum where states meet and discuss. It has a small secretariat, but the Secretary General is more a secretary than a general. It has no operational capabilities, except, of course, when it goes into peace-keeping missions and peace enforcement missions. But that's a different matter.
If we were focusing, change the focus more to Islamist terrorism and the failure of multiculturalism, as was declared by both Merkel and Cameron recently, how big is the threat of terrorism in Europe today?
Well, both Merkel and Cameron and Sarkozy made statements to the effect that multiculturalism had been a failure. But these are quite irresponsible statements in a continent that has been mixed so often. I mean, it's 505 million people. We have 15, perhaps 20 million Muslims. Some of them are Europeans, like in the Balkan, and most of them are well integrated. Some are even assimilated. There's a small minority, especially among the second and third generation, that rejects what Europe stands for. But that's a minority within a minority. And to talk about the failure of multiculturalism is grossly exaggerated. What is the level of terrorism in Europe? If you look at the annual reports of Europol, they list between 500 incidents in 2007 to around 250 incidents now. The number of Islamist incidents is very, very small. But that is partly due to the fact that they have been intercepted, foiled, or some of them failed of their own.
There's a lot of cooperation within the EU on economic matters, health issues. Is there also on terrorism? I mean, do they share information? Do they have a joint task force to combat it, or is it every country on its own?
No. I mean, the European matters are falling under three pillars, and the judicial pillar, home affairs, is basically a national issue. But the EU itself has increased its counter-terrorism budget 17-fold in the last 10 years. Europol's mandate in this area has been enlarged. Eurojust, with its arrest warrants, has come in. And there is also an incipient intelligence agency in the European Situation Room in Brussels. There is counter-terrorism czar. First it was Gijs de Vries, now it's Gilles de Kerkhoff, whose authority goes over all three pillars. There's a coordinating function, but by and large it's still national states that fight terrorism in Europe. There are a lot of bilateral agreements. There are all sort of clubs, like the Bern Club, that are not directly linked to the EU. But on the whole, it has been quite successful, at least when it look at the figures of incidents that have been stopped. But we have to remember that most incidents are national incidents and not transnational incidents. Only 1 in 8 incident is a international, transnational incident.
Okay. What obstacles do law enforcement and counterterrorism organizations inside Europe face with combating terrorism?
I think there is the obstacle of languages. There are not enough linguists and analysts that speak the relevant languages. Another obstacle is that the police forces themselves do not fully reflect the diversity of societies, so among its ranks they have not recruited enough people from minorities. And then, especially when it comes to jihadist terrorism, because religion is involved, states often, in Europe you have the separation of state and religion, are very hesitant to enter religious buildings, to enter argumentation on the value of one religion over the other. So that are a couple of problems that persist.
I want to go back to the UN, since you were the former officer in charge of the terrorism prevention branch in the United Nations. How effective, or to what extent, is the UN involvement detrimental in combating terrorism?
I would not say that it's detrimental. It has done no harm. Has it done any good? I think if you look at the different issue areas, for instance, creating an international legal regime, it has now 15 conventions and protocols against various types of terrorism: hijacking, diplo-napping, hostage-taking, bombing, and these have all been signed by most member states, ratified by most member states, implemented by many states, especially Security Council Resolution 1373 of 28 September 2001, with a whole catalogue of almost 75 measures. This is now being implemented in the last 10 years. We have, since September 2006, an action plan, broad and wide, for terrorism, which has unanimously been adopted by the General Assembly. It's very rare in UN history that something is unanimous, because the United Nations is sometimes not united. So, the UN has no operative capabilities. But Interpol itself has also no operative capabilities. They have to work through national authorities. So there's a handicap there. But on the whole, I would say the UN has done more good than is, for instance, acknowledged in Israel.
Okay. What is the biggest challenge facing international counterterrorism and law enforcement officers in the next 5 years?
I think one of the challenges is the information overload. We have now so many monitoring institutions, but some of them work parallel to others without informing each other fully, and that has created some friction, bureaucratic turf wars. That is one thing. And another is the issue of border security. We have replaced national borders with a Schengen information system, but that system is only as strong as the weakest link. And we have now, due to the events in Northern Africa, quite a stream of people, bona fide refugees, economic refugees, but also people who have been released from prison, whose record, both in political crime and in normal crime, is substantial, and we don't know where they are. There has also been, especially now after the events in Libya, a leakage of weapon systems, including man-pads, these surface-to-air missiles. So the combination of escaped jihadists and uncontrolled weapons will pose a challenge in the coming 5 years for Europe.
What can we as counterterrorism experts do to change the situation or to actually help improve it?
Well, I think we have to make recommendations to policymakers that are based on empirical evidence. We have to evaluate existing and planned counter-terrorist policies so that we do not build on sand. There have been huge investments made in the last 10 years, for instance, in the field of bioterrorism, while the threat from this area is very small. I mean, weapons of mass destruction in the hand of terrorists would be a nightmare, but the weapon of mass destruction is the fertilizer bomb, is the Kalashnikov. These are the big killers. But we have to see this in proportion. I mean, terrorism has killed in the last 10 years 65,000 people worldwide, has wounded perhaps 3 times as many. That is a big loss. But if you look at the loss from war, the loss from car accidents, the loss from preventable disease, from natural disasters, and so you can continue the row, it is a relative threat. We should not underestimate it, but we should not play politics with it. We should not exaggerate it. People have been scared after 9/11 into accepting whatever some politicians have said, and they have not always been well informed. And if you want the public to be more resilient, you have to feed it with responsible information through the right channels, and not by politicians who try to be more alarmist than those in the other party.
Well, Professor Schmid, thank you very much for coming to us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Mr. Ladau.
הרדיו הבינתחומי